Greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on this live signing of Battle for the American Mind, authored by myself, Pete Hegseth, and my co-author, David Goodwin. And we're psyched to be here. We are actually, to set the scene a little bit, and by the way, you can send in questions. You go to premiercollectibles.com/battle. Send us questions. We're here to sign books. We've already signed a bunch of them. A bunch. And we're going to be signing more now. And you can purchase a copy, a signed book. It's the only place you can get it. So if you want one, use that URL. You're already watching us anyway. And also share it with friends and family, anybody else. This will live on and people can continue to order signed books as well. But this is really the only opportunity to ask us some questions about the book. We already have some in the hopper and we're going to be here for an hour. So if you've got questions, we hope we have answers for you. And just to provide a little context, we are deep in the bowels of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in Simi Valley, California, because we're about to go on stage in about 2 hours for a book event here at the Reagan Presidential Library, which is pretty cool, considering him and what he represents. And we're in the Jefferson Room, or at least the portion of the room where is the Jefferson Room, which if you've read Battle for the American Mind, he is featured in it for some particular reasons about the founding. If you didn't, I didn't know this till I met David, that Jefferson had written his own version of the Bible, or at least the New Testament.
Right.
And that fits into the story of how our founders viewed Western civilization and our country. And then the progressives showed up and it all changed. But that's a whole nother story. So we're just glad you're here. I'm checking right now. I got my laptop in front of me. As your questions come in, we will address them. And it's kind of like an online version of Fox and Friends. So we're glad you're here. And David's been a guest with us on Fox and Friends many times now for the book. So David, just out the top, it's been a whirlwind couple of weeks. Thank you to everyone out there who made Battle for the American Mind a New York Times #1 bestseller, which we know they didn't want to put us #1. They had to, though, because the response was so strong. Multiple times over the #2 on the list, and they couldn't find a way to rig it if they wanted to. So we're proud, not because it's the New York Times, but because it is a reflection, we believe, of a thirst for this topic, for an understanding of it, and a sense of what we can do with solutions. So David, just out the top, introduce our audience to how you got into education, and then into the research that led to this book, while I drink my Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation natural spring water. Yes. David, without David Goodwin, this book absolutely does not happen. So David, how did you come to this topic overall?
Well, we can definitely say that goes both ways. Obviously, without you, Pete, this book does not succeed. And your contribution to it was actually quite substantial. So the way the book originally came about, I got involved in classical Christian education in the 90s. I worked in a tech company and was working my way up the ladder there, and in the after hours doing volunteer work, and ran into classical education. And I soon realized the potential it had. At the time I first got involved, didn't have kids, but I could see that our country was in dire need.
I didn't know that. So you got involved before you had kids in a system.
About 4 years before I even had a child of my own at all. Not just in the system. She was not born. So
ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
I had my kids knee deep in public schools before I figured this stuff out. So
well,
he's ahead of it.
They say that, but really it was a happenstance. I just thought that education had more bearing on the future culture of the country than anything else we could do. And it turned out it was more so than I knew.
Mm-hmm. And more so than you knew in spades, you got involved in starting schools. We're happy to answer questions about classical Christian education, which David is an expert on. And now, finally, next year, all of my kids will be in classical Christian schools, which I'm very, very happy about. But what parts of your research first really got you going, David? Because the research you bring to this with an understanding of what's been done to our classrooms, what jumped off the page?
Well, it was that first time that I had heard that word plasticity from the progressives in a lecture from a professor. It was a dry lecture. You wouldn't expect much to come out of it, but the word itself was important. And so I thought I'd go look it up. I went and looked it up, and I started pulling the thread, and it kept unraveling this great story that I had never imagined had happened. And certainly, as you, Pete, and I have explored this, it leads all the way to our present situation. We know exactly why things are happening today because they intentionally designed it to do, to take the country in a direction where they could control the narrative.
They absolutely did. And by the way, let me remind you, questions, we're happy to take them. I'm monitoring them right now. We've had a few pop in. PremierCollectibles.com/battle. Order the book. This is the only place to get the signed copy. Already, as David is talking, I'm thinking of portions of the book that he's alluding to that expand on the topic to get to the depth of it. But you mentioned plasticities, which is a word I don't think I've ever used outside the context of this book. I now will. But the progressives understood that if they could mold the viewpoint of the youngest kids, that was a key for social change, cultural change, political change. We think of it as the universities, especially the lunacy of the universities, but early progressives had the youngest kids in mind.
Well, that's true. And the odd thing the reason this caught me was that the way they used the word plasticity, I expected them to use it as in they wanted to control it. But the way it was used was they couldn't let parents or the church be in charge of it. They couldn't let someone else control it. And that led me to believe that there was something there to control. And that, of course, was paideia, which you and I now have talked about many times.
And then we discover ancient Greek words that we've never used in any other context. But you know what? It's funny. Ever since undertaking this project, I've looked around at whether it's scholarly journals or articles or names of schools, and not even just classical Christian schools. The word paideia is out there. You see it. It's a Greek word with no direct translation in English, which if you're not looking for it, you may not encounter. But our founders, these guys right here, they knew the word paideia. They read Greek and Latin. Even Jefferson, Jefferson right here. We mentioned him early on. How would you classify him as a Christian?
Not a Christian. I would say he was a deist.
A deist, for the most part. A deist. Even though he rejected the biblical truth of the New Testament, of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, he knew it was so central to understanding our system and our culture and our civilization that not only did he basically took the New Testament, and after we did this, I went and dug into it. He literally took a writing of it and cut out the verses that he liked or agreed with. And it's now known as Jefferson's Bible. Yep. So he took out all the miracles. He took out anything he thought was supernatural or anything that didn't seem plausible. But it said all the principles that Jesus talked about. And said, here's the Bible I subscribe to. It's actually quite endearing when you think about it. And it's a reflection of how much they
understood paideia.
Yeah.
I mean, they really did understand it. Now, Pete, I have a question for you. So you did the interviews for Miseducation of America, and many of those were some pretty profound scholars, Robbie George, Victor Davis Hanson, and in the film, they all seem to know a lot about paideia.
Yeah.
So tell us how, when you asked that question, did they immediately resonate with it?
They did. They
almost a few bars?
No. They almost looked at me like, wait. How do you know about paideia? But in a good way. In a good way. Robbie George especially was able. It was actually quite affirming for us as we're writing this, and editing this manuscript, and we're using a phrase, and you'll see it in the book, Western Christian paideia, which then eventually becomes the American progressive paideia, and today the culturally Marxist paideia, all laid out. At first, I thought, okay, is this way too academic-y and a little bit too abstract? By the way, it isn't. I mean, it's a testament to respecting your readers and your audience, because I don't know about you, but the feedback I've gotten has been, wow, I love the introduction of that word and what it means. And it makes me want to learn more and dig deeper into it, for sure. But yeah, it was very affirming when I looked Robbie George in the eye at Princeton as I was interviewing for Miseducation of America. And I said, now, because part of the project on Miseducation and this book was, you're the expert who's built schools from the ground up and is now the president of the Association of Classical Christian Schools. I'm a parent who's really passionate about this and have done some research and certainly understands modern politics at some level. And I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. When I asked the question in Miseducation of America, at first I was asking to see if maybe all of them wouldn't know what it was. I thought, okay, I'll ask Victor Davis Hanson. I'll ask Robbie George. I'll ask Bill Bennett. We'll ask Newt Gingrich.
Newt was good on it.
And they all were, had some version of, it's the education of our youngest, or the molding, or the enculturation, or the development, or the transfer of education, or a way of life, all of which are parts of the definition that we work through in the book. But if you forget and don't transmit who you are to the next generation, the story both gets lost and changes. And that's what they're counting on.
It gets retold.
Yes.
It gets told by the progressives. That's what they wanted. Take away the story that had been there for 2,000 years, and let's put one in that we can change going forward, because, of course, progressive by its nature looks forward, not backward.
And that's the scary part of right now. And we'll get into the origins of the book a little bit, which actually happened before COVID happened, before 2 weeks to slow the spread that has never ended. Ultimately, we started this project before that, but the madness that's been unleashed in the last 2 years inside our classrooms has only affirmed the thesis of the book, and shown how dangerous and how much we're teetering in our own culture, because we're pumping out a generation of young kids, generations now, and soon to be more if we don't stop it, that are completely antithetical to, and not only don't know, but reject the values of our founding. Where does that, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, because we're going to get to the questions, but where does that lead? What does that look like?
Well, one of the telling things for me was that in the year or maybe 9 months that led up to our, while the book was in process and you and I were writing our different parts in different places, is you would text me, because you're on the TV, you're always up to date on the news, and you would say, hey, this fits our thesis. This is what's going on. And so in comes another part of the book. So it was kind of written real time.
It really was written real time. I mean, I feel like there could be an update at some point. Not that I'm saying there is. It's a relief to be through the process and now promoting it and almost through that as well. But you're right. It was happening in real time because, and I've used this quote a lot as we've talked about the book, and I wish I had discovered it as we were writing the book, but Ernest Hemingway once talked about bankruptcy by saying it happens gradually until it happens quickly. And I think that fits our thesis of this book quite well. What we try to lay out is the gradual nature of what the progressives started, not knowing exactly where it would lead, and then this sudden revelation. Because, there were signs in the 90s and 2000s and rulings and things that happened and changes of tests and all that. But it wasn't until COVID, when parents really saw it, and I think when progressives decided that it was time to press their advantage because they controlled everything, that it happened very quickly. And do you think that creates, before we get to our first question, that creates an opportunity? I mean, are we looking at an opportunity moment right now?
I think so. I think we're at a break point, and I think that there are some things you can never get used to. We got used to a lot of things over the last 50 years. We got used to God being out of the classroom. We got used to protest culture. We got used to but when you start seeing young children in drag or being in front, basically sexually exploited, and it's commonplace, suddenly nobody gets used. I hope nobody gets used.
I think you're right. When you can't get used to your 11-year-old son coming home and saying, I have privilege, right, Dad?
Right.
Right. Here's why. That's a jarring moment for a lot of parents. So as scary as we think this will be for you if and when you engage with it, I'm probably more hopeful right now than I have been at any point in writing the book or promoting the book because of that overexposure of what the left represents. By the way, again, go to premiercollectibles.com/battle if you want to order a copy of this book, signed copy. Order 10 of them. That's great. We'll sign away all day long. And we've, again, been very humbled by the response of this book. So we're going to jump into first question for you, David. You take it, and then I'll take it. Is it Siler? I'm going to go with Siler from North Dakota. Asked, what is the biggest takeaway you want readers to gain from this book?
That that this wasn't indoctrination that they were inserting into the system. It was actually the key ingredient of a republic that was taken out of the system. When they removed what are called the 7 liberal arts, the grammar, logic, and rhetoric, they removed the element that made it possible to have a freely governed civilization.
Mm-hmm. That is really the key thesis of the book when you dive into it. If you say it in a sentence, it can sound simple. They removed God.
Right.
Because we sort of know that to be the reality of classrooms. But once you engage with the history of it and you realize, oh, it wasn't just some 60s radicals. Oh, it wasn't just the Warren Court that showed up out of nowhere and banned prayer and banned Bible reading in schools. There was 50 years of work before that where they not just removed God, but replaced him with a very a good forgery, or at least a forgery that worked for the time. The reason I'm looking at my phone is I have a text that I sent to my wife, but I got from somebody else this morning. Bill Barr, did I send it to you, David?
Did.
I sent it to you. What was it again?
Well, it was a story, a speech he just recently gave on education being the most important thing.
Correct.
That we can. And Bill Barr has one of my favorite quotes. I've used it. I think I used it in the book.
Yes, we did use one quote from Bill Barr.
Right, where he was giving a speech at the University of Notre Dame, and he said that our culture is surviving on the vapor trails of Christianity.
Yes.
Meaning that we're lucky to have made it this far, and things are going to decay a lot more if we don't restore it. And I think that was one of the big things, in the book. A lot of people see prayer being taken out of school, or religion being suppressed in school. It's kind of a bad thing, but not a destructive thing, because you could still teach it at home or do something else. But what it really does is it pulls the carpet out from underneath how we know anything. And when you pull the carpet out of truth, what you have are people can make up their
insert whatever you want.
identities,
Yes.
make up their
Well, you replace it with
their
false
sexuality, make up their they can do anything they want.
Absolutely right. The article was in the Daily Wire. It came out yesterday. And the headline is former Attorney General William Barr warns Western civilization, get this, facing its deepest crisis since Jesus Christ, which sounds like it's over the top. But if you read the book also, we're not trying to be momentary about this and say we live in the worst moment of all time and like that. But he's effectively saying a civilization's ability to perpetuate itself is based on things it knows to be true. Obviously, Jesus over 2,000 years ago was a massive and divine disruptive force in what had been a narrative for quite some time in Jerusalem and in the so-called Western world. He's saying on Saturday, this is yesterday, to his audience, that the threat, what he believed was a threat to the entire Western world, was the U.S. public school system.
Yep.
He's not just saying culture writ large. He's saying U.S. public school system, which seeks to control how children are raised while creating a hostile environment for traditional religion. That's pretty heartening to me. I'm pretty sure he hasn't read the book, but we need to get him a copy. But if other people are coming to that same conclusion at this moment, well, I mean, others are as well.
It's no coincidence that it's coming to someone who's dedicated their life to the law, because the rule of law, we take it for granted. Blood feuds were the way of handling, before the West came along. If you had a beef with somebody, you just killed them. I mean, it was like mayhem. And we just think that we're better now because we've progressed. We really just owe it to the Western Christian paideia that it said, no, there's a rule of law that needs to, what is it? The premise, we're a nation of laws, not men.
Equal justice, a nation of laws, not men. And the more you research and understand human history, to your point, David, the more you understand how rare that actually is.
It is very rare.
And wherever it exists in the world today is a variation or a branch off of Western Christian paideia.
Exactly.
It was not a concept otherwise conceived. And it's exactly what our founders, it's that grappling of, our founding generation with those eternal truths and human nature that led to the system that that's still safeguarding us to this very week, where you have a Supreme Court standing up and saying free expression at the 50-yard line for a high school coach, okay. You know, you Second Amendment right in New York State, you can't just tell people they can't carry concealed. School choice in Maine, you should be able to, the dollars should be able to go to a public or a private institution. And of course, Roe v. Wade, by rejecting a horrible decision from 50 years ago. If they hadn't set up a system of checks and balances with co-equal branches, the progressives would have 40 years ago buried those things completely to the point we wouldn't even had a shot right now.
Oh, we see it right now all the time. The progressives use the system where it benefits them, and they reject the system whenever it doesn't.
Absolutely right. We see that across the board. My biggest takeaway, I agree with David, that is the biggest takeaway, because we miss the obvious, because it's been status quo for so long, that it was the removal of Christianity and faith that accelerated and started all of this. The other big takeaway I want for readers to gain is to put the book down and then do something. I mean, that to me that's why we call it Battle for the American Mind. It's ongoing. We're all a part of it. And that's why the largest section of the book is section 3, which is about what the solution is and what you need to do about it. I've already been really heartened by responses I've gotten from people that have said, I read it and it rocked my entire worldview and overturned a lot of assumptions and sort of lies I was telling myself, which I've told myself too, that my school's okay, or this is going to be all right. And that's my hope, is that it leads to a renaissance of even more of what David does in building and planting classical Christian schools. By the way, if you're watching this or you've read the book, you would have seen it in the book, but even if you're just familiar with the topic, classicalchristian.org is the website for David's association, and there's a map right there. I can't tell you how many times I've scanned over that map. David knows this because what we're dealing with, and it lists and shows every school across the nation, over 400 now, of classical Christian schools that you can find. I mean, there's one in your state. I think there's 46 of 50 states at this point have one.
You know, Pete, something happened last week that's never happened before. I've been running our national conference for the association for years. We always have, around 1,000. We had a larger group last week. People came up to me who had never been to our conference, hadn't heard of classical education. They got the book, figured out that the conference was associated, and showed up.
Really?
Paid the money at the door. It's like, you don't have a school? No, we're dedicated to doing what you say in the book.
Oh,
it was kind of crazy. It
was really interesting. And
I had 3 people tell me that.
Read the book, saw the website, or learned about what you did,
Mm-hmm.
went to it, saw the conference was on, and then went to the conference?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I love that so much.
It was unbelievable.
That's great. That's what we're hoping for. Question from Christy in Wisconsin. What inspired you to write this book now? Why now?
I think I could give a few answers, but they would be because I've been at this a while. Let's ask that. I think you're the best person to answer that.
A culmination of wanting to write something about education for quite some time. And we do include in the book the fact that other books I've written previous to this, In the Arena and American Crusade, talk about education a lot and allude to them. And even the last one had a chapter on education. And I talk about how utterly insufficient and frankly superficial my understanding was of education in those books. So I've always had an impulse in this feeling. For me, it was this belief that, first it's your parents and your family. Second, it's your church community and your faith. But third, if you want equal opportunity in this country, it's giving people an opportunity to be educated and think freely and chart an American dream for themselves. And the classroom is the place that you do that. And to me, it was always about test scores and excellence and all of that, because I had the same progressive assumption that most parents had for the longest time. They're like, yeah, you can send your kid to Christian school if you want, or yeah, you can send him to homeschool if you want, but it might be a little weird, or it's not that great, and it's not that different. Or I went to public school, so my kids are going to public school because it's not beneath them to do that. Mm-hmm. And that was until just a few years ago. And so thank goodness, I believe providentially, I was held back from throwing into some book on education that would have been, ridiculously superficial and unhelpful. And instead, the reason it became the right time is because I met this guy. And we met 2.5 years ago. We tell a little bit of the story in the book. And I had a lot of questions and was coming around, understood classical Christian a little bit, but not really. And we just started a back and forth over email and over the phone, built a friendship. He shared a manuscript that he had been working on that unearthed a lot of this stuff. And I remember turning to my wife after reading a portion of it and saying, we got to do this. People need to know this. And at first it was a film, and David mentioned it, Miseducation of America, 5-part series, now 6-part series actually on Fox Nation, that is well worth watching. I'm not just saying it because we're both in it, but John Case, a mutual friend of ours, produced it and did a phenomenal job taking the pages of this book and bringing them to life. Or actually, the book came after the film, so take in what direction you want. But it just, as David laid out what the early progressives did, and the Bellamy Salute and the Gary Plan, and all of these light bulbs were going off in my head. And it just became clear, hey, let's further this partnership and put it into a book. And David, you start out there on the progressives, and I'll start at modern time, and we'll meet in the middle. And he added so much about the church history, how the church, abdicated its responsibility in education, or frankly, fell into the arms of the progressives in that process. So what inspired me to write the book now is meeting the right person with the right information at the right time, and then being blessed with a platform to share it, which that's sometimes there are partnerships that are completely mutually beneficial and providential. I believe that. And, this won't be the end of our partnerships. I look forward to many years of a lot of things, but pretty good start, shot out of the cannon.
No, I as the head of the association, I talk with media not infrequently, and your unique interest in it caused you to keep coming back. I mean, I think you called me, repeatedly for about
I did. You're
5 or
probably
6
like, oh
week
man,
period at the beginning. No, it was great. I mean, most media people want to get the story and get out fast, and you kept probing. You kept going deeper, and that's why I think the book carries itself.
Absolutely. Here's a question from Franklin, Tennessee, south of Nashville, from Jamie. I haven't read it yet, so we're doing this in real time. Do you mention in the book about the importance of right ordering of the affections? I'm thinking of what C.S. Lewis talks about as a chestless education in the abolition of man.
Ordering of affections. Insider.
I think that might be. Is it? It probably is.
Oh, I don't know.
There is a classical Christian school in Franklin, so there could be.
Yes, but there is.
We did not plant this question because I know that we did talk about the ordering of affections quite extensively.
And the abolition of man. I think we have a quote or two from it in there. Yes, the abolition of man, Dorothy Sayers' Lost Tools of Learning, Mortimer Adler's Great Conversation, Hutchins. I mean, there were a cadre of people at the beginning when the progressives first seized control. A bunch of people recognized it and saw what had happened, and they sent up the flag, but they didn't send it up till about 1945 or just shortly thereafter. And by then, the horse was out of the barn. The progressives had control of the money, they had control of the teachers, they had control of the colleges. So at that point, it was, C.S. Lewis definitely pointed to the loss of the affections. There's a famous quote where he says that a crutch is a poor substitute for a leg. In other words, you can only teach duty to children for so long. You have to teach them to love what is good and what is true and what is beautiful. And if they love it, they'll never feel like they have to be moralized. And that's sort of the thesis of that, and the thesis that all of us have written on our hearts, a form of understanding God, and that can be turned into a Christian paideia with the right training. So.
Yeah, I mean, the portion that David wrote for that section of the book educated me too. And again, that's where when we got into the liberal arts and all of the things that had been taken out, I just thought, man, I didn't learn any of this.
I know.
I didn't learn any of this.
I wrote a booklet called, the subtitle was "You Wish You Could Go Back to School," and I got that from about 50 parents who'd come through my office and said that. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, writing and editing and then reading and going through the process of this book was one of the greatest educations I've ever received on who we were, how we got here on that level, what's been done to it, and how much we have to rediscover, which is why it is such a testament to David and classical Christian schools, what they've built. And actually, we dedicate the book to parents who pioneered classical Christian renewal now 40 years on, because it was, if you had to describe the darkest days of education in America, it would probably be the 1970s, when there were no classical Christian schools. They were almost about to outlaw homeschooling. And that was the consolidation moment. And a few brave parents, many of which hail from Idaho, where David's from, started schools. And what was the book that they read most initially?
Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning.
Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. That inspired them to rediscover those lost tools of learning, form brick and mortar schools. And now we're 40 years into that insurgency, which we talk about in the book. And there are schools out there, and there are options, and you can find them, and we can fund them, and we can build more. And frankly, that's what I'd love to help be a part of going forward, is evangelizing because we're going to need, in order for this to be successful, we're going to need a lot of really rich dudes that have a lot of money that we don't have, that start to say, hey, my alma mater and having my name on the library there is actually funding an institution that's doing everything it can to brainwash kids in a belief system that I reject. So how about we skip the whole library thing and instead give to a movement that is creating free thinkers and lovers of Christ at the K through 12 level, which insulates them from the madness when they get into universities. I hope, you're doing that. Charlie Kirk is doing that at Turning Point USA. There are a few really bright lights that are making that call. And that's part of the next turn that we talk about in the book, is getting kind of an all of the above approach, meaning we have to create an entirely new ecosystem. And that's part of the thesis of the book that I think some people are jarred by. I mean, they say, what do? We say, get out of government schools right now. And that's not to say they can't be changed eventually, but if you have a kid in one right now, what you agitate on is not going to do enough to change the system so it changes for them. And getting them out and finding an alternative, knowing full well that that's difficult for a lot of people to do, that is, a central part of the message we push in the book, for sure.
Yeah, as you mentioned that, I'll tell you another story, Pete, I haven't gotten to tell you yet. We only shared a car briefly on the way over here. So another thing that happened last week is I'm signing books, and a guy comes up and gives me the book, and he goes, you aren't going to believe this story, but last week a gal shows up at my school that I've never seen before, and says, are you a classical Christian school? I just read this book. Gives him a 7-figure check.
Really? Are you serious?
Serious. Yeah, very believable. I mean, the way he told it was like, he said, I've never seen anything like that. So that's what we need, is people
awesome.
grabbing an oar.
That's awesome. Grabbing an oar. You don't have to have kids in school. You have grandkids. You got a big checkbook, whatever it is. It's not like we're making money off of that. This is about just, that's a really cool story. I love that. I had not heard that. Let's see. Well, this question is, how did we get here? But let's answer the second part of Calvin's question from Arizona. What part do you think social media has played in the age of miseducation? He says misinformation, but we could also say miseducation and hiding true information. As someone who runs schools, the accelerant of social media on top of this.
Well, we're seeing right now, and I know this is going to be tried, everybody's heard this before, but it's really happening more seriously than it used to, is that the cell phone is driving attention spans down so far that even in our schools, we're having a very difficult time, focusing kids long enough to work on, some of the heavier stuff that we do. So I think social media has a lot of negatives, a lot of positives, but I think that for kids, it's generally very negative.
I think so too. I mean, I also think it's just such an accelerant, because even if you're inclined in junior high to push back on what a teacher is saying, or in high school, because you're like, well, that doesn't comport with what I learn at home or at church. And the groupthink of social media and the sort of woke social justice side, it makes it, it's one thing to speak up in class or try to push back on a paper. It's another thing to go on social media and take a stance that's countercultural when you know the wave's going to come down on you.
Well, and our culture is screaming that you need to be, have your own personal identity. And so you can construct your identity out there on social media and make yourself anything you want to be. And that's just unhealthy for all of us, but
Yeah.
it's certainly unhealthy for younger kids.
Sure, it's absolutely right. Which is why I have a running debate with my kids, the oldest of which is 12. Because before I started all of this, I think we had said 13 is what we'll be with the phone. It's now moved up to 16, and I think it's 18 right now. They don't know that yet, but I just see the destructive effects all around me. And this is not to indict all the parents and their friend groups and all of that, but when I see little 9-year-olds staring at their phone and pulling up social media and making cracks about whatever they're making cracks about, your brain's not ready for that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's reinforcing something that you think is cool in a way that just is destroying. I mean, for me, it was my parents wouldn't let me watch The Simpsons back in the day. Think about how that seems trite to talk about that at this point. Let's do a different one to mix it up. Peyton from Colorado, first to you, David. Not book related, but get to know him a little bit more. Favorite thing to do with your family?
Oh man, we backpack a lot. We're in Idaho, so the outdoors is where we spend our time, and our family has always been into backpacking. As I've gotten older, I found that mules are good things.
So you're talking backpacking with mules
now.
Yeah.
When we were younger and our kids were
but
younger.
this is then legit backpacking. This is not drive to a trailhead and walk for 4 hours. You're talking about real deal.
Yeah, 3-4 days.
3-4 days.
Maybe 6 days in some cases. But yeah, that's
so
our
it's
fun.
Backpack, camp, carry anything you can carry on your back or a mule can carry out.
Well, one thing that's been very helpful is that when you do that, you suddenly realize when you get to one of those hotels that just doesn't quite have their act together and the water's not right or the towel's not, nothing's as bad as backpacking.
Yeah.
Right? So, if you can sleep on the dirt in the middle of nowhere and get bugs and snakes and stuff, then everything else sounds good.
How many times did it take you? How many times did you backpack before you figured out how to pack correctly without 2 days in realizing you're utterly short on something?
Oh, yeah, I'm still learning that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good.
Every time it's something.
That is not, we do the camping thing, which is one of the things we love to do. We do it frequently with the kids and they absolutely love it, but we have not yet detached ourselves from the opportunity for modern amenities if need be.
Well, we used to car camp. The problem with car camping, my wife finally decided she wanted to only backpack because in car camping, there's no limit to what you can stuff in that car.
Mm-hmm.
In a backpack, you got, all right, so here it is. It's not like 2 weeks of planning,
Yep.
2 days of camping, and then anyway, we're
It's
way
true.
off topic.
We are way off topic, but this is like Fox and Friends, okay? The producers say stay on the book, and we say we go anywhere we want. By the way, we've got about 20 minutes left on this live signing. PremierCollectibles.com/battle. If you have any questions, send them in to us. We're checking them in real time. I'm refreshing right now. We also, you talk about off topic. If you look at the questions they sent us at Premier, do you have any hidden talents? What color is your toothbrush? What is your pet's name? So we could go way off topic if we want to, but we're choosing not to right now. Let's see. Here's a question from Terry in Illinois. She works for a district in Illinois. They have hired a diversity, equity, and inclusion person. We had a speaker say, throw everything our parents have taught us out. It's garbage. Even if you choose to send your kid to a private school, now we have to watch every part of the district. Is anywhere safe?
No, because what you're talking about here is a religion. They claim to have taken religion out of schools in the 60s. They didn't. They just replaced it with a new religion that has orthodoxy, and it has priests. And what you're talking about there is orthodoxy that you're not allowed to question.
Mm-hmm.
And it has its priests, those who are the enlightened elite among us who get to tell us how and what we should think.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a product of taking away the ability of children to think on their own. And then when they grow up, they still don't have that capacity. It's very challenging. I have to say, when I took this on, as I told you, one thing people have come up and said to me what they like most about the book is that neither one of us are like pretentious scholars or something. We're just a couple of guys, true. Right? You more. I'm not going to say it. You're more so than I. But You know, I don't know. I think as you know, as anything goes, you exchange one religion for another,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what we've done. And until parents understand that, you're basically having what you and I talk about in the book, the humanist manifesto and
Mm-hmm.
humanist society. This wasn't just a fleeting curiosity that happened for a few years. It's the theory and operation of the religion in America today.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically what we're studying, what we're worshiping in our schools.
For sure. And the scary part is, at West Point, the military academy, the Army, recently it was shown that that critical theory, critical race theory is being taught there as well. What was scarier to me was some of the questions that were asked. It's answer this question using DEI, using CRT. So it's not engaged with the idea of CRT.
Right.
It's answer the question, but you only through the lens of CRT.
That's a very astute point.
And that is what you're talking about as far as orthodoxy. That becomes part of the liturgy, and it's not to be questioned, as opposed to what the left likes to tell us, which is, well, this is just an academic theory in higher education that gets debated. No, as it's being applied as the answer.
Well, and that's one of the things that's very unique about the Western Christian paideia that we talk about in the book. When it fused with the Greek paideia, what it did was Christianity didn't do, the Islamic world did the same thing, and they ultimately rejected the Greeks because it conflicted with parts of their orthodoxy. Christianity said our orthodoxy can stand up to scrutiny. So let it be. Let's take the logic and the rhetoric and let's have at it, and let's find truth, and let's sharpen ourselves. And that's the uniqueness of the Western Christian paideia.
For sure. Let's see. Andre from Kansas City, Missouri. A nice, good geographic diversity here. There is, good diversity, geographic diversity. Pete, as a parent, how can we have children to challenge and respond to the socialist brainwashing? So let's say your kid is already down the rabbit hole. How do you respond to that?
How old's the kid?
Well, we don't know.
Yeah.
Andre, help us out here, man. Give us some details.
Yeah.
Let's just say you're noticing it in middle school and your kid's starting to come home and it's gender pronouns and it's a victim and oppressor and oppressed. And, how do you undo?
You've got to get them out of the environment first off, because you can't stop it if it's going to be continuously reinforced at school, because there were days, certainly in the era that I grew up, there were leftist teachers who taught leftist things, but that's very different than what we've got going on now in the schools, where there's a leftist orthodoxy which carries weight against the social fabric of the school.
Yeah.
So any kid who wants to push back isn't just the idea. It's not just pushing back the idea. They have to push back and get defriended.
Yeah. That's kind of goes to the social media part of it too.
Ostracized.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's where I think it's just a different moment. That's why what Bill Barr is saying, what he's saying is, you are now, the new radical is the kid who's attending a classical Christian school, because it's completely antithetical to the orthodoxy of a standard public school, not a Berkeley public school or a New York City public school, but a Indiana public school or an Arizona public school or a North Dakota public school or Wisconsin. And part of what we were able to kind of figure out as we went through the book is how this idea of local control, which, okay, I'll move to a conservative community or I'll move to a nice zip code. Maybe that makes a difference on the margins, and I would acknowledge that it does. You're going to have a different type of school, say in rural Kentucky, than you would have in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as far as emphasis. However, the teachers that enter into those schools are oftentimes completely insulated from the cultural values of that community because they went through the same, more or less, federalized pipeline of education, which lands them in that classroom with that textbook, with that curriculum, with the certification, the accreditation that came from the same places as the teachers that go to Cambridge, Massachusetts. That's kind of the scary realities. You're not escaping anymore by moving to a place where you think it reflects your values. So I would echo what David said. Get out if you can in any way. Pete, are you running for Senate? No. Let's see. This is one for me. You being a combat vet, and we do talk about this as a war in that context, and our strategy in a military context. What is going on in America that you and others fought so bravely for that hurts the most? You veterans are simply the best. Well, thank you, Ben, for that. In Austin, Indiana, what hurts the most? I think in this is the ripping away of the innocence of kids who ought be allowed to learn to wonder and to explore and to be innocent and to, learn about things like truth and beauty and grappling with big questions of a relationship with God and my place in the universe and all these things that when you reduce them to an identity of their sexuality or their gender orientation or their race or their socioeconomic status or their victim status, you're inserting all these things that I never encountered until I was in college, if and when I encountered them. And so I had an opportunity to grow and learn and be influenced by my parents and my pastors and my community, where right now it's the innocence lost of this process. Is I don't know how you undo that and rediscover that, which is a pretty hard thing. I don't know. How would you answer that? What hurts you the most as you go through this process?
Oh boy. I think that's a uniquely veteran question, and I'm not a veteran.
No. I mean, just okay. As a patriot, what do you see?
I guess, and I guess we'll have to go to speed round here to get through some of these. But
we won't get through all of them. Don't worry about it.
But in a brief setting, as an American, it's that we were given by our founding fathers probably the best concept of a republic ever to be formed, and we're squandering it. Mm-hmm. That's probably the hardest for me.
You're exactly right. I just went in. It's in my bag. I just went to a Barnes & Noble to see if a copy of our book was there. And there weren't many, by the way, because it was pretty much sold out, which was cool. Mm-hmm. But I grabbed a book right at the checkout that was a leather-bound book. It said $10 only. And it was the Constitution of the United States and all the, what that author deemed to be the great works of America's Republic. Mm-hmm. And I opened it up and I said, wow, that's pretty darn good. Like, it's a good cross-section. And I just opened it up in the middle, and it was a speech that Benjamin Franklin gave at the closing of the Constitutional Convention. And it's only 2 pages inside this book. I just read it 2-3 days ago. And in it, he talks about how, of course, he has reservations with the Constitution. It's not perfect. But as he's lived through life, he's learned that he's not perfect either, and he's made lots of mistakes, and he learned to rely more on others. And if these many minds have come together at this moment, it may not be a perfect document, but it's one he will support. It's basically a republic if you can keep it. But to hear him talk about the recognition of even the brilliance of that moment and how hard they had grappled over these ideas, knowing, because he says early on, in the middle of the speech, he says, we will keep this republic until we lose something like our cultural bedrock or something to the point where we require a tyrant. He just comes out and says it. He said, this system is going to last as long as we have citizens capable of defending it, and then they're going to go for a tyrant, because that's what history has shown us.
To which he was referring to Paideia.
Yes.
And yes, I can only imagine that. I think there's an adage we use a lot in the classical movement, leave it better than you found it. Mm-hmm. And that's, I guess, the greatest regret I have. It's also the greatest encouragement. I hope we can leave it better than we found it.
I think, you're right. In a macro sense, we're losing that. But I'm encouraged as a dad that even if it took me, till 6th grade for one of them, I believe he's going to leave high school with a better understanding than I had when I left high school. Yep. So I think we can do a little bit, leave it better than you found it in our own lives with our own kids by saying, stop, enough. Yep. Make a different choice. Madison from Texas says, as students, student reader, writer here, it's great. How can we be respectful yet stand for truth with classmates and teachers? What would your advice be to students?
Boy, that is a hard one. I don't know if you're a person of faith, but I would say prayer that your heart would be to love them and move them rather than to argue with them.
That's a great response. I won't try to add to it. Rocky from Lenore City, Tennessee. When you fail at some endeavor, personal or professional, how do you move forward? Not really related to the book, but a good life question. My dad used to say to me, the phrase that has never left me, it's all how you respond. You're always going to fail. You're never going to meet the standard that you should. How do you respond to that dark moment or difficult moment will define the next chapter. So that's sort of a generic way of looking at it. But once you realize you are not the center of the universe and you're as fallen as anybody else, it's a quite liberating understanding to then seep in the wisdom of everyone else and try to draw from it. Certainly, as I have drawn from David in this process too. Any thoughts on failure and moving forward?
I would pick up a copy of Marcus Aurelius's writings. He has a lot that relates to that. And one thing I've found, the day that I took over the classical Christian school, I called in one of our best teachers and said, "Hey, I've never read a classic. I don't know anything about this. Tell me what I should read." And he gave me The Last Days of Socrates. It was changed my life because suddenly I realized there was so much wisdom in Greece and Rome. It was unbelievable. I had always imagined that it was kind of, old stuff for old dead guys.
Mm-hmm.
But it really, I would encourage you to look to the wisdom of some of those. Marcus Aurelius is really good on that particular point on failure. So.
Mm-hmm. We already answered that one. What's a piece of advice that two old guys can give to Generation Z? That's not what they wrote. I editorialized that. Scott from Michigan said, "What's a piece of advice or call to action to Generation Z?" Which generation exactly is Z? Is that the youngest one coming out right now?
Under 23 or under 24, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So below the millennials.
Besides, don't believe Dr. Fauci. Man, learning doesn't stop would be mine. I mean, if you had the benefit of a great, classical Christian education, fantastic. If not, then start one.
Mm-hmm.
The great books are out there, and there's wisdom to be accessed for sure. Any thoughts there?
Probably don't be conformed to this world, the way it's currently going. That's
spot on. By the way, we've got we have in TV parlance 7 minutes to go before the end of this show. premiercollectibles.com/battle. You can still get a signed copy. We're probably full up on questions at this point. And we're just grateful you've joined us. And we hope you've learned a little bit. I've learned a ton from this guy, and we are humbled by the response of this book. That all we're really trying to do is tease out the wisdom of Jerusalem, Athens, and these guys behind us that channeled all of that 250 years ago and created a system, if we can keep it, which we're certainly losing moment by moment before our eyes. Again, Battle for the American Mind, premiercollectibles.com/battle. We've signed a bunch of them. I know we haven't signed any right now as we're going. Maybe we'll sign a few because we should. It is a live signing. So if you get this copy of the book, by the way, you get a copy signed by both David and myself, which is not always the case because he lives in Idaho and I live in New Jersey. So we see each other when we can. How many days did you, by the way, come over to my house when we did this project? Remember? How many days was that? Did you ever come over?
No, I don't think I've ever been there.
So I'm thinking of John Case. I'm thinking of our producer.
Oh, yeah.
So John Case, who's our intrepid producer, I don't think where'd you sign?
That would be the same place you're signing. Okay. Yeah, I just probably didn't sign that one.
I'm thinking of a session he did at my house for a couple of days, but it was you and I that did phone calls.
Well, you came to my place.
I came to your place. That's part of what I'm thinking about too.
We went downtown to the Bass Quarter. That was about the extent.
We did. I came out and saw one of the best man caves in America from
Tim Anstein,
one of your buds.
Yeah.
And got to meet your family. By the way, your wife is here for the Reagan event, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stormy's coming. So that'll be great. And wow, we actually signed these books. That's part of what we're supposed to do on these things. So let's see. We got a couple more. We'll take one more question, and then we'll each just give a closing statement, and then we shall be done. This one's for me, Laura in Iowa. How did you begin in broadcasting and politics? It was an accident. I was in the military, did veterans advocacy, and started doing segments on TV, and it led to an opportunity to host Fox and Friends, and then been doing it ever since. So Tucker went from the weekend show to prime time, and I kind of jumped in his seat, which was kind of the conservative seat on the show at that time, and still there. So that's it. Just, do something you love and go at it hard and develop a bit of an expertise in it or something you're passionate about. And then maybe if you're interested, find a way to get to do it on the air as well. So David, we got a couple minutes left. If you were just had a closing thought for our audience, and this will live on the internet too, as something people can access in the future. Here we are, June 28th, year of our Lord 2022. Book's been out for 2 weeks. The #1 New York Times bestseller. Might top the list again this week. We'll find out soon. Who knows? Ultimately, those are superficial things that don't matter in this world, or in the next world, I should say. What's your takeaway as we've gone through this process together as two co-authors?
Well, it's very humbling. I mean, you brought a lot that I would never have brought to this, and obviously I had some of the technical knowledge. I think my challenge for people would be, hey, if you find this book useful, pass your copy on or tell somebody else to read it. Neither Pete nor I, it's kind of an interesting story. Neither of us really did this to sell books. It was to get the message out. And that's the goal I have is I want everybody who resonates with this story to join in and be part of the fight, because that's what the battle for the American mind's about.
Boy, that's what our hope is. We hoped we would get a big response because of its ability to be featured in Fox and all that. But a book that changes or helps drive a conversation is a book that has legs. And I hope the same thing, that if you love the content of the book, you're sharing it. I got a text from a friend who said he was at a carry concealed class in what state was it? I can't remember. It was a carry concealed class in state I can't recall. And the guy who texted me had served with me in the military. He didn't know the instructor of the carry concealed class, but the instructor of the carry concealed class started out his carry concealed class saying, "I've bought 15 copies of this book and I give it out to everybody." No, really.
No.
I mean, so that's our hope
thing.
is that it becomes that type of book. It's passed around and shared and say, "Oh, you got a problem in education, take a look at this." And it's only going to be, humbly one part of the conversation. But I remember, Closing of the American Mind, written by Alan Bloom in the 80s, that talked about higher education. Hopefully this helps set off the alarm bells for a lot of people and motivates them to do more. I can just say that it has been nothing but a joy to work with this guy right here across the board. It has been a great partnership.
You could dedicate your platform to a lot of different things. I appreciate that you did to this.
Well, I can think of no better educational earthly cause than this. And by the way, what David emphasized in the book too is going to a classical Christian school isn't going to save your soul. That's not, we each have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ and pray the same for our kids and for everybody out there. But sending your kid to a school is not a catch-all for every single aspect of their life. But we think it can give them a slingshot opportunity. So we appreciate you sticking with us here at the live signing for Premier Collectibles. PremierCollectibles.com/battle. I hear that a signed copier is easy to pass off to a friend later on if you want. So get a signed copy from this, and it'll be even more fun to hand along to the next person.
Or keep it and just have them mail from Amazon to your friend.
Okay, I like that too.
Yeah.
Put your friend's address in from Amazon, and then everybody wins in that equation. I like that one too. So on behalf of David Goodwin and myself, and Battle for the American Mind, thanks for sticking with us for this hour. Hope you check it out and share it with friends and family. God bless you. Take care.
Hey, this is John Acuff, New York Times best-selling author of 7 books and someone who's done a live signing. If you like the one you just watched, make sure you check out our YouTube channel. It's full of amazing authors having great conversations and signing books for viewers just like you. So make sure you subscribe, and thanks for watching.